Tonight, we take a quiet look at the life of a midfielder who learned how to begin again. A story that moves slowly, without urgency, shaped by moments that did not ask for attention. There is a moment that often passes without notice. A player moves into a space that did not seem open a second earlier. Not far from the play, but not fully inside it either. Before the ball arrives, he has already looked ahead. Once, then again. The pass reaches him, and it does not stay long. One touch shifts the angle. A second sends it away. The defense reacts, but it reacts too late. The space closes exactly as expected, and the ball has already gone somewhere else. Nothing dramatic has happened, and yet something has changed. Christian Eriksen was that kind of player. On a typical passage of play, he might receive the ball just outside the congested centre of midfield, having already scanned the space ahead of him twice before the pass arrived. Not a glance, a proper look, held for a half second, taking in the position of 3 or 4 players at once. Then the ball comes. He takes one touch to shift the ball. It is not spectacular, just enough to create the angle he already understood. By the time his second touch releases it, the moment has passed for the defense. They have pressed. The space has closed, except that he already saw it would close, and the pass has gone somewhere the press cannot reach. 2 touches, a second and a half of time. And yet something has changed about where the game is. That quality, the ability to find time inside moments that feel rushed to everyone else, did not arrive suddenly. It was not a gift that appeared in adulthood. It came from somewhere specific, from a childhood in a small town in Denmark, from years of learning the game at a pace that had nothing to do with spectacle or urgency. Christian Eriksen was born on the 14th of February, 1992, in Middelfart. It is a modest town on the island of Funen, the central island of Denmark, connected to the Jutland Peninsula to the west by one bridge, and to the island of Zealand to the east by another. The town sits comfortably between things, rather than at the centre of anything. It is not large, a few thousand people, surrounded by the gentle, flat landscape that characterizes much of that part of Denmark. Low fields, quiet roads, a harbour. The kind of place where children play outside without needing to go far, where football happens in parks and on school pitches, and in the evenings when the light stays long in summer. His father, Thomas Eriksen, was a football coach at a local club. That proximity to the game from an early age mattered in ways that are difficult to measure. Precisely, but easy to recognize in retrospect. A child growing up around a coaching parent absorbs things without being formally taught them. The language of the game, the way adults talk about positioning and movement, the difference between a player who was in the right place and one who wasn't, and why that difference matters. It is a kind of osmosis, not instruction, just presence. Eriksen grew up hearing football discussed and watching it organized, and by the time he was old enough to play with any seriousness, the game already felt familiar in ways that went beyond kicking a ball. He joined a local youth club and played through the early age groups the way most Danish children did, in a structure that was community-based, recreational in character, and focused on participation rather than selection. Danish football at the grassroots level had spent years developing a system that tried to keep children engaged without over-specializing them too early. The environment was not pressured. Games were played on modest pitches. Coaches worked with groups of children who had varying levels of ability and commitment. In that setting, A child with a particular gift for the game would stand out not through physical dominance, but through understanding. Eriksen was slight. He was not going to be the boy who bullied opponents off the ball, but he was already the one who knew, a moment before the ball arrived, what he was going to do with it. The next significant step was Odense Ball Club. Odense is the largest city on Funen, a 20-minute drive from Middelfart, and OB had a youth structure that operated at a considerably higher level than local clubs. Being selected for that system required ability that had already made itself visible. The training was more organized, the coaching more specific, the standard of opponents higher. Eriksen spent time developing within that environment, working through the age groups, receiving coaching that was more structured in its focus on technical ability and positional understanding. The city itself was not overwhelming. It was a provincial Danish city with a comfortable scale. But the training environment pushed him in ways that the earlier clubs had not. He learned to receive the ball under more pressure, to make decisions faster, to understand that the space available in games at this level was smaller and needed to be created rather than found. Word of his ability spread the way it does in football, quietly, through the network of scouts and coaches who pay attention to youth football in specific regions. Ajax, the Amsterdam club, with one of the most respected academy structures in European football, identified him when he was around 14 or 15 years old. The assessment process at Ajax was thorough. They were not looking purely at physical attributes or technical ability in isolation. They were looking for players who understood the game, who could process information quickly, who already thought in terms of positioning and movement rather than simply ball skills. Eriksen apparently demonstrated those qualities clearly enough that Ajax wanted him in their system. Moving from Funen to Amsterdam as a teenager is a considerable step. He was leaving his country, the language he had grown up with, the proximity of his family, the familiar landscape of flat Danish countryside and modest towns. Amsterdam is a functioning European city, busy, dense, multilingual, with a pace of life that has nothing in common with Middelfart. The Ajax Academy players lived in accommodation provided by the club, trained daily, attended school, and existed within a structure that was designed to develop them as footballers and as people. The club had been doing this for decades and had developed an approach to managing young foreign players that tried to ease the transition without removing the challenge of it. De Toekomst, the Ajax training complex, whose name translates as the future, was a place where technical precision was the baseline expectation, not an aspiration. Players were coached to think before they received, to understand space in both phases of play, to press collectively and recover shape quickly. The Ajax Academy in that period had already produced a long list of players who went on to significant careers. Wesley Sneijder, Raphael van der Vaart, and others who had passed through the system in the preceding years. The methodology was consistent enough that players arriving from outside the Netherlands could understand what was being asked of them relatively quickly, even if the execution took time to develop. Eriksen moved through the Ajax youth system across several years, and the development he underwent there was substantial. The environment required adaptation. Dutch was a new language. The tactical expectations were specific. The physical standards were higher than anything he had encountered in Denmark. There was a period of adjustment, becoming familiar with the city, with the club's culture, with the way the academy coaches expected players to move and think. He was not the biggest presence in those squads. He remained slight through his teenage years, growing gradually, but never becoming a physically imposing figure. What he had was what he had always had, the capacity to read the game slightly ahead of those around him. To be in position before position was obviously required. The Ajax first team operated in a style that the academy was designed to feed. Positional football, technically demanding, organized around maintaining the ball and finding passes into the spaces that collective movement created. For a player who had spent his youth absorbing those principles, the step from academy to first team was a continuation of something familiar rather than a departure into unknown territory. The principles were the same. The quality of the opponents and teammates had increased sharply, and the speed at which decisions needed to be made was considerably higher. But the underlying logic of how he was expected to play was consistent. He made his debut for the Ajax first team in 2010 at the age of 18. The club was managed by Frank de Boer, who had taken over that year and would go on to lead Ajax to 4 consecutive Eredivisie titles across the following seasons. The squad at that time contained experienced Dutch internationals alongside younger players coming through the system. Eriksen's debut minutes were limited at first. Substitute appearances, brief cameos in league matches. But he was professional in his preparation and thoughtful in the way he absorbed the experience of being around first-team training daily. Over the following seasons, his involvement grew. He was not the kind of player who forced his way into a team through audacious individual performances. His integration was more gradual, coaches trusting him with more minutes because he used them quietly and correctly, rarely making the kind of mistake that cost possession in dangerous areas, consistently finding passes that moved the team forward rather than sideways. His assist numbers began to accumulate. He was creating chances at a rate that exceeded most players his age in the Dutch league, and his ability to deliver from set pieces, corners and free kicks struck with a clean, whipped technique gave Ajax an additional attacking weapon at dead ball situations. Ajax won the Eredivisie 3 times during Eriksen's years in the first team squad. Those title wins were collective achievements, built around a group of players who shared an understanding of the system and executed it consistently over the course of long seasons. Eriksen was not always the most prominent player in those squads. There were older, more established figures who carried more of the leadership, but his role became increasingly reliable. He was the kind of player that more experienced teammates trusted. Give him the ball in a tight moment, and he would find the right answer. European scouts had been watching him for some time, by the point his contract at Ajax was approaching its final year. The level of interest reflected how clearly his qualities translated from observation. In the Eredivisie and in European competition, he was visibly different from midfielders who relied on energy and physicality to influence games. He influenced through thought. In an era when football was increasingly focused on pressing and athleticism, a player who could make pressing less effective through positioning and timing had a particular kind of value. In the summer of 2013, he signed for Tottenham Hotspur. The reported fee was around €11 million. At that level of the Premier League transfer market, it was considered modest for a player with his profile and potential. Tottenham had finished 5th the previous season and were operating under Andre Villas-Boas, trying to build a squad capable of sustained Premier League competition and regular European football. The club trained at their facility in Enfield, to the north of London. The city itself was completely unlike Amsterdam in character. Larger, louder, more diffuse, a metropolis rather than a compact European city. The training facility, however, was focused and professional, and the squad included Danish international teammates he knew from the national setup, which eased the initial period of adjustment. The Premier League was a different physical environment from the Eredivisie. The pace of games was higher. Opponents were more aggressive in pressing and in physical contact. The spaces that had been available in Dutch football were smaller in England, and the time on the ball that Eriksen had occasionally enjoyed at Ajax was not available in the same way. Midfielders in the Premier League faced opponents who pressed with athleticism and intensity, and the game punished slowness of thought rather than rewarding it. For a player whose entire game was built on using thought to create time, there was a period of recalibration. He was not slow. He never had been. But the recalibration required understanding exactly how much faster each decision needed to be made. His first full season at Spurs was one of integration rather than dominance. He played regularly, contributed to the team's build-up play, and began to demonstrate his set-piece qualities in the Premier League. But the step-up in opposition quality showed in the overall output. There were matches where the combination of pace and physicality around him made it harder to find the patterns of play that had come more naturally in Amsterdam. That experience was not failure. It was a process that most technically sophisticated players go through when moving to a more physically demanding league, and the following season would show how much he had absorbed from it. The arrival of Mauricio Pochettino as Tottenham's manager in the summer of 2014 changed the environment at the club significantly. Pochettino brought a very specific vision of how football should be played: intense, pressing-oriented, demanding high energy from every player across the full 90 minutes. The physical demands he placed on his squad were considerable. Players who did not commit to the pressing game were not going to find consistent minutes in his system. But within that system, Eriksen's role became more clearly defined. He was the player who could receive the ball after the press had won it back, and immediately find the forward pass that turned defence into attack. He was the recycling mechanism in possession, the calm centre around which the more athletic players moved. Pochettino trusted him with significant responsibility. In the attacking phase, Eriksen was the player with the most freedom to make decisions, to drift, to find space in the half spaces, to receive between the lines and play through or around opposition midfields. The system gave him license to be creative rather than simply industrious, and the creative qualities that had developed across his youth and Ajax years had room to operate. He responded by producing his most consistent performances since leaving Amsterdam. The assist numbers from his peak Tottenham years were among the highest in the Premier League, not in isolated seasons, but consistently across multiple campaigns. He was creating double-digit chances per season from open play, delivering set pieces with accuracy and contributing goals of his own, particularly from long range, where his flat, well-struck technique made him dangerous from positions outside the penalty area. He was not a high-volume scorer, but his goals tended to come in moments when they mattered, and the technique with which he struck them was distinct, not driven with pace, but placed with calculation, into corners, using the goalkeeper's positioning against them. His free kicks were one of the more discussed technical qualities of that period. He approached them consistently. No long run-up, a measured approach. The plant foot positioned to create the angle he wanted. The striking foot connecting cleanly across the ball to produce the curling or dipping trajectory the situation required. He was not infallible from free kicks. No player is. But his delivery percentage was high enough that Tottenham's opponents had to organise carefully to defend against them. Opposition managers included Eriksen's set-piece threat in their match preparation. The Tottenham squad that Pochettino built across those years was notable for its collective quality, despite limited spending, relative to the league's wealthiest clubs. Harry Kane had emerged as one of the best strikers in England. Dele Alli had developed into a creative, energetic presence in the number 10 area. Heung-min Son had arrived and brought pace, goals, and positional versatility. The fullbacks, Particularly, Kyle Walker and Danny Rose in their best periods contributed to attacks with regularity. Within that group, Eriksen was the player who connected phases, who moved the ball from midfield into attacking areas with the accuracy and timing that allowed his teammates to make the runs they were making in transition. Training at Spurs under Pochettino was known for its intensity. The sessions were fast, physically demanding, and technically focused. Eriksen's preparation before sessions was meticulous. He was described by those around him as a player who arrived fully prepared and who understood what was being asked before it was repeated. In a dressing room that contained significant personalities, he was not a loud presence. He did not lead through speeches or forceful communication. His influence was more practical. The consistency of his performances, the reliability of his decision-making, the fact that teammates could trust him with the ball in tight situations and expect the right outcome. The 2018-19 Champions League campaign with Tottenham was the furthest the club had progressed in European competition in decades. The knockout rounds that season included a round of 16 tie against Borussia Dortmund, a quarter-final against Manchester City, decided across 2 legs with dramatic late goals, and a semi-final against Ajax, a club that carried particular meaning for Eriksen, that required a stoppage-time comeback to resolve. Throughout that run, he played his typical role: present, accurate, connected to the team's patterns. The Ajax semi-final was played at the Johan Cruyff Arena in Amsterdam. The first leg at Tottenham had produced a result that left the tie finely balanced. In Amsterdam, Ajax dominated the match for long periods, scoring 3 times to take a significant aggregate lead. In stoppage time, with the tie apparently over, Tottenham scored 3 goals in rapid succession to progress to the final. Eriksen played in that match. He scored the first goal of the comeback, a corner delivery that deflected in off a defender. The noise in the stadium during those final minutes was considerable, but he remained composed throughout, playing within the moment rather than outside it. The final in Madrid was against Liverpool. Tottenham lost 2-0. The match was difficult for them from early on. A penalty conceded in the first minute and a second goal that sealed the result late in the second half. Eriksen played his part without defining it in either direction. The disappointment of the result was real, but the run itself had demonstrated what the squad was capable of across a sustained period of European competition. In the period after the final, questions about his future at Tottenham had been circulating for some time. He was entering the final year of his contract and had not signed an extension. Clubs across Europe were aware of his availability. Discussions took place through the summer without resolution. He returned for the season, played through the autumn, and in January 2020 completed a transfer to Inter Milan. Antonio Conte had taken charge at Inter the previous summer. Conte was one of the most tactically precise managers in European football. His systems were specific, his demands were high, and the role allocated to each player was clearly defined. He had won multiple league titles with Juventus and had managed at Chelsea and the Italian national team. His arrival at Inter was understood as a serious statement of intent to challenge Juventus's long dominance of Serie A. The system Conte ran used 3 central defenders, 2 wing-backs who covered large amounts of the pitch, and a midfield typically organised around a double pivot or a more structured triangle, depending on the match context. The wing-backs were asked to function almost as additional attackers when in possession, and to track back and defend when out of it, covering enormous distances per game. The midfielders in that system needed to be industrious, positionally disciplined, and capable of contributing in both phases. Eriksen's early months at Inter were uneven. The transition from Tottenham's attacking-oriented system to Conte's more defined structural framework required considerable adjustment. Conte's sessions were known for their intensity and their very specific positional requirements. Players who had operated in more fluid systems could find the rigidity demanding. There were matches in which Eriksen played a limited role, and a period in which his place in the squad hierarchy was not entirely clear. The adjustment was real, and the Italian press noted it with interest. Eriksen was a player of clear quality, but Conte's system was not easily accommodated by players who had spent their careers in possession-oriented attacking setups. The conversations around that period suggested some friction, not interpersonal conflict, but the ordinary difficulty of a tactically precise manager integrating a technically specialized player into a system built around very different principles. Over time, and with Eriksen remaining patient and professional throughout, Conte found uses for him that aligned with his qualities. In matches where controlled possession was required, closing out results, managing tempo late in games, Eriksen's ability to receive under pressure and release the ball quickly gave Inter an option that the more aggressive members of the squad did not provide. He contributed from set pieces. He scored important goals, including a decisive free kick in a Europa League match that was of genuine significance to the club's progress in that competition. Inter's Serie A title win in 2020-21 came after a sustained campaign in which they led the league table for the majority of the second half of the season. Conte's organisational work over 2 years had built a squad that was collectively efficient, defensively organised, quick in transition, clinical in front of goal. Romelu Lukaku led the attacking line with remarkable productivity, supported by Lautaro Martinez. In midfield, the combination of Brozovic's technical range and Barella's energy provided the engine of the team's functioning. Eriksen's role within that was not a leading one, but it was genuine. He appeared in meaningful matches, contributed to results, and was part of a group that achieved something significant, ending a period of Juventus dominance that had lasted nearly a decade. He did not know, at the end of that season, that it would be his last at the club. The European Championship that summer brought Denmark together for what would be an emotional and at times difficult tournament. The team had qualified through their Nations League performance, and there was real optimism about their prospects. Denmark had developed a solid squad with genuine quality across multiple positions, and with Eriksen at the centre of their creative play, they were considered capable of progressing through the group stage and into the knockout rounds. Their first group match was against Finland at Parken Stadium in Copenhagen. Copenhagen, in early June, sits in a particular kind of northern light. Long evenings, the sun moving slowly across a sky that stays bright well past 9 o'clock, a quality to the air that belongs specifically to that latitude in early summer. The stadium holds around 35,000 people and was at capacity. The atmosphere was warm, the occasion significant. A home match at a major tournament for the first time in years. Eriksen was wearing the captain's armband that evening. In the 43rd minute, following a routine throw-in on the left side near the Denmark attacking third, Eriksen jogged toward the ball as he had done thousands of times in his career. And then he fell. Not from a tackle, not from any contact. He fell forward, to the ground, and did not get up. His teammates were the first to respond. Simon Kjær reached him within seconds. Kjær, the experienced Serie A defender, who had been Eriksen's colleague at international level for years, moved to the correct position immediately. He stabilized Eriksen's airway, preventing the tongue from causing obstruction, and called for medical assistance. The Danish goalkeeper, Kasper Schmeichel, was among those who surrounded the area, and other players moved to form a screen around their teammate, while the medical team entered the pitch. The medical staff arrived quickly. The Parken Stadium had defibrillation equipment available at the stadium, which is standard procedure at UEFA events, and it was used. He had suffered a cardiac arrest. His heart had stopped. The resuscitation process took several minutes. The medical team worked calmly and with focus. The stadium was quiet, in a way that large stadiums rarely are. Tens of thousands of people watching in near silence as something entirely outside the framework of the sport was taking place on the pitch below them. Television broadcasts showed colleagues and opponents in tears. The Denmark team gathered nearby, visibly distressed. Referee Anthony Taylor suspended the match immediately. After several minutes, Eriksen's heartbeat was restored. The medical team stabilized him on the pitch, transferred him onto a stretcher with appropriate care, and moved him by ambulance to Rigshospitalet, the major hospital in Copenhagen. He was alive. He was conscious by the time he arrived. In the hours that followed the match, updates came from Denmark's team doctor and from the Danish Football Union. He had stabilized. He was conscious. He had been able to speak. By the following day, he had spoken to his teammates via video call, his voice audible and clear, his mood described as calm under the circumstances. The information shared publicly was careful and measured, accurate, without overstating or understating the severity of what had happened. The cause of the cardiac arrest was not fully established in public reporting. Investigations were conducted. The conclusion that followed was that an ICD, an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, should be fitted. The device is small, typically placed under the skin in the upper chest area, near the clavicle, connected by leads to the heart. It monitors the heart's electrical activity continuously and delivers a controlled shock if it detects a dangerous rhythm, ventricular fibrillation, or certain types of tachycardia that would otherwise be life-threatening. It is a widely used device in cardiac medicine. Many people live entirely normal lives with an ICD, including people who are physically active. The procedure to implant the ICD took place in hospital in Copenhagen. Recovery from the implantation itself was measured in days, not weeks, in terms of the basic healing process. The broader recovery, physical, mental, emotional, was a considerably longer undertaking. The regulatory problem became apparent relatively quickly. Serie A rules at that time prohibited players who had implanted cardiac devices from competing in the league. The regulation existed as a protective measure based on a historical approach to cardiac risk in professional football in Italy that had been shaped by earlier incidents involving Italian players. The effect, however, was that Eriksen could not return to playing for Inter Milan, regardless of his medical clearance from independent specialists. His contract was mutually terminated in December 2021. He was 30 years old, without a club, carrying a device in his chest, and had not played competitive football for 6 months. The weeks and months after the Euro 2020 collapse were spent in Denmark. He was close to his family. He had his partner Sabrina Kvist Jensen and their children nearby. The immediate medical recovery was monitored carefully. He attended consultations with cardiologists. The ICD was checked regularly. His physical condition was assessed at intervals to understand what kind of exertion was safe, and at what pace a return to activity could be progressed. Training in those early months was not team-based. It was individual, controlled, and gradual, beginning with walking and light movement, progressing to jogging, then to runs at higher intensities, monitoring heart rate and electrical activity throughout. It is a process familiar to cardiac rehabilitation medicine, a structured reintroduction to physical exertion that moves carefully through intensity thresholds, checking that the heart responds as expected at each level before advancing. For an elite footballer, the process ran in parallel with ongoing medical evaluation, and the timeline was not fixed in advance. There was no public pressure on him to return. The medical and football communities were united in suggesting that any decision about a return to professional football should be made entirely on medical and personal grounds, without external pressure. Several cardiologists commented publicly that the ICD meant the risk of a fatal outcome from a repeat event had been substantially reduced. The device would act before a life-threatening situation developed. But the question of whether to return to elite competition was understood as one requiring individual assessment and personal choice. He trained privately through the autumn of 2021. He worked to maintain physical condition. He followed the development of the ICD monitoring data. He spoke with medical specialists about what competitive football would realistically mean. The physical demands, the exertion levels, the contact involved in the game. The conversations were technical and grounded. He was not pursuing a return for symbolic reasons or from external pressure. He was assessing whether the life he had been living as a professional footballer was something he could responsibly continue. The conclusion he reached was that it was. In January 2022, Brentford Football Club announced his signing on a short-term contract until the end of the season. Thomas Frank, the Danish manager who had known Eriksen through the Danish football environment, had been involved in those discussions. Brentford were a Premier League club in their first season after promotion, a well-organised, coherent team that played an attacking style, rooted in direct football and intelligent pressing. The squad was modest in terms of individual names, but considerable in terms of collective organisation. The environment Frank had built was calm, professional, and focused. The days before Eriksen's first competitive appearance back were not public spectacle. He had trained with the squad through the weeks since signing, reintegrating into team training at the pace appropriate for someone returning after that length of time away. The sessions were normal training sessions, technical work, tactical organisation, small-sided games, set-piece preparation. He was one member of a squad preparing for a Premier League match. The significance of his presence there was obvious to everyone who was aware of what had happened 6 months earlier. But the day-to-day reality of preparation was mundane in the way that all training is mundane. His first competitive appearance was as a substitute in a Premier League match against Tottenham Hotspur at the Brentford Community Stadium in early February 2022. The Brentford ground is compact. The stands are close to the pitch, the atmosphere enclosed. It holds around 17,000 people. He came on in the second half and played approximately 30 minutes. He received the ball, moved it, found passes, occupied the spaces that needed occupying in his natural way. There were no moments of theatrical significance. He played football, quietly, the way he always had. The response from inside Tottenham's squad during and after that match was noted by journalists covering the game. Former colleagues expressed warmth. The applause from both sets of supporters when his name was announced was genuine and prolonged. The moment carried meaning that the football itself did not need to provide. Several weeks later, in a league match against Newcastle United at the Brentford ground, he scored. The goal was struck from outside the penalty area. A left-footed shot hit with the flat, clean technique that was his signature from that range, travelling low and hard into the corner of the net. It was the kind of goal that required no exceptional athleticism, only a clear mind and a well-practiced technique executed at the correct moment. He had scored hundreds of similar goals in training and in matches across his career. This one carried more weight than most, not because of the technique, but because of when it came. He played 6 more matches for Brentford that season, contributing in his customary role, controlling tempo in midfield, creating passing angles for teammates, finding spaces between opposition defensive lines that allowed the team to progress up the pitch. His physical condition was described as good. The monitoring that accompanied his return, medical checks, ICD readings, performance data, did not reveal any concerning patterns. He completed the season having demonstrated, in a quiet and grounded way, that the return was real. In the summer of 2022, he signed for Manchester United. Erik ten Hag had been appointed as United's new manager that same summer, coming from Ajax, a club with whom he had won the Eredivisie and had a deep association with the technical and positional principles that had run through Dutch football for decades. Ten Hag's vision for United was ambitious. He wanted to restore a style of play that prioritized possession, pressed high, and moved quickly in transition. The squad he inherited had significant problems: inconsistency, injuries, a lack of clear tactical identity over the preceding seasons. Building a new culture required specific personnel. Eriksen fitted several criteria that Ten Hag was looking for. His technical quality was beyond question. His understanding of positional play aligned with the Ajax-derived principles that Ten Hag brought to the club. His experience, Eredivisie, Premier League, Serie A, Champions League, major international tournaments, gave him a breadth of tactical knowledge that younger players in the squad did not yet have. And his composure under pressure, his ability to receive in tight spaces and release quickly, was a quality that United's midfield had lacked in recent years. He signed on a 3-year contract. The training facility at Carrington, United's base in Trafford, was one of the better resourced environments in European football. The infrastructure around the players was extensive. The squad he joined contained significant individual quality, alongside real inconsistency. Cristiano Ronaldo was still at the club through the early weeks of that season. Marcus Rashford had not yet reached the form he would show later that year. Bruno Fernandes had been a consistent performer, and the defensive structure was being rebuilt. It was a complex environment. His first season at United was his most productive as a Red Devil. He played regularly across midfield, operating in double pivot alongside Casemiro when that combination was available, and in more advanced positions in certain tactical setups. His passing accuracy was high across the season, and his ability to switch the angle of attack with a single long ball to either flank was a visible quality in United's build-up play. He formed a functional midfield partnership with Casemiro, the Brazilian's defensive solidity, complementing Eriksen's technical range in a way that gave the unit some balance. United won the League Cup that season, defeating Newcastle United in the final at Wembley. It was the club's first trophy in several years, and the significance within the dressing room was real. Eriksen's contribution to the run, consistent performances in earlier rounds, and in the league matches that maintained their position through the season, was part of that collective success. He also contributed to United, reaching the FA Cup final that year, though they lost to City. His form through the season was recognised as one of the more reliable elements in a squad that could be inconsistent in other areas. The following season was more difficult. Injuries disrupted his availability during a period when Ten Hag was continuing to try to build consistency. United's results were irregular, the squad's form fluctuating across competitions in a way that made building patterns over consecutive matches harder. Eriksen was 31, then 32. His game had never depended on pace or athleticism in the way that younger midfielders might rely on those attributes, which meant the aging process had not visibly diminished his technical qualities. But managing the physical demands of a full Premier League season while maintaining the cardiac monitoring and regular medical checks was a continuous undertaking, one that operated quietly in the background without ever becoming the dominant story, but which required ongoing attention and management. He continued to train with full commitment through that period. The physical management after a cardiac event of that severity is not a one-time adjustment, but a permanent feature of daily life. Regular checkups with cardiologists, monitoring of the ICD's data. The device records electrical activity continuously, and that data can be reviewed by medical specialists to assess whether any concerning patterns are emerging. Adjustments to training load based on medical guidance. The process was invisible to most observers and routine for everyone involved at the club, but it was real, and it required a particular kind of discipline to manage alongside the ordinary demands of professional football. His time at United came to a close after that second season. The club and player parted ways. The exact circumstances were not dramatized publicly. It was a contract situation reaching its natural conclusion in a context where the squad was being reshaped and Eriksen was entering the later phase of his career. He left with his reputation entirely intact. Ten Hag and colleagues spoke respectfully about his professionalism and his contribution. What followed was a period of consideration about where the next phase of his career might take him. He was in his early 30s, technically still capable of performing at a high level in a controlled role, managing his physical output intelligently. The options available to a player of his profile and experience at that stage of a career were not limited to one path. He remained in contact with clubs across Europe, considered his situation, and approached the decision with the same measured quality he had always brought to things that mattered to him. His involvement with the Danish national team had continued in parallel with all of this. He had returned to international football after the cardiac arrest following a careful reintegration process. Playing for Denmark in that period carried a particular kind of significance. It was the context in which the event had happened, the stadium in Copenhagen where he had collapsed, the teammates who had been around him in those minutes. Returning to that environment required a psychological adjustment that went beyond the physical. He did it. He played at the 2022 World Cup in Qatar with Denmark, featuring in their group matches as the team worked through their campaign. Denmark in that period were a competitive but not dominant international team. They had quality in midfield, solidity at the back, and were capable of competing with stronger nations on a given day. Eriksen's role in the national setup had evolved over the years. He was no longer simply the emerging talent he had been at his first major tournament, but an experienced senior player whose presence stabilized younger teammates. The responsibility of that role suited him. He had always been more effective as a calming presence than as a demanding one. His reputation across the game, among players, coaches, opponents, had a particular quality. Managers who had faced his teams spoke about the difficulty of accounting for him in match preparation. He was not the kind of player you could assign one marker to and expect the problem to be solved. He moved into spaces that were not obvious, created angles that did not exist until he positioned himself, and released the ball at a timing that was slightly ahead of what the opposition expected. Accounting for him required organizational discipline across an entire defensive shape, not just the attention of one individual. Players who had been his teammates across different clubs described a consistent personality, calm in the dressing room, not a loud voice, not a forceful personality, but one whose influence was felt. He asked good questions of coaches. He thought about the game in a structured way and was willing to discuss tactical problems seriously. He did not need external validation. He did not perform emotion for an audience. But he was warm, straightforward, and reliable in the way he dealt with people around him. There is something in that consistency of character across years and across very different environments. Amsterdam, London, Milan, Manchester, that reflects a person who knew from an early age who he was and what he was trying to do. The quiet town in Denmark, the training ground at the Tokomst, the sessions under Pochettino, the difficult months under Conte, the hospital in Copenhagen, the training sessions at Brentford in winter light. Through all of it, the essential quality remained the same. A player who found time where none seemed to exist, who moved to the right position before it became obviously the right position, who released the ball at the moment that opened something for the team, rather than the moment that felt safe for himself. That quality is not learned in a single environment. It develops across hundreds of thousands of repetitions, in youth clubs and academies and training sessions and competitive matches, in the accumulation of experience that eventually becomes instinct. By the time he was playing at the level he reached, the decision-making was no longer conscious in the way it would have been for a younger player. The scanning, the positioning, the timing of the pass, these were automatic, deeply embedded through years of consistent practice and thought. The game had become, in a sense, a language he was fluent in, one he thought in, rather than translated into. A player who stepped away without warning and found a way to return without needing attention. A presence that settled back into the rhythm of the game, as if it had always been there. The movement slows. The game softens. And as everything grows quiet, the night follows. Good night.